In this module, we're going to talk about global exception handling. We talked about it at length in the previous lesson, but I wanted to review some salient points so that you can understand the purpose of global exception handling. So if you recall, we talked about how exceptions bubble up. So they may occur in one method, and if they're not handled there, they'll bubble up to the method that called that method. If they're not handled there, they'll bubble up to the method that called that method. And at some point, we're outside of the code that we write, and we're into the ASP.NET event pipeline. All right, don't want to talk about that right now. That's the internals of ASP.NET. But essentially, it'll keep bubbling up, and if it's not handled by anything or anyone, then finally the ASP.NET runtime will handle it and will say, there was a problem, here's a yellow screen of death, user, hope that helps you out. All right, and ideally we don't want our end user seeing that yellow screen of death. We want to handle these exceptions ourselves. Maybe we handle them so that we can retry them using a different set of input, or just swallow the exception, don't tell the user, don't act as if anything's different, just don't do anything. Or we might want to throw up our hands and tell the user and say, hey, whatever you tried doesn't work, try it again later, something like that. But we want to put the try catch around any time that we're going to call to another method that we know returns an exception, anytime that we're going to make calls to resources that are outside of our control as developers. So again, web services, network services, local file system, database servers, things of that nature that could be intermittently out, could be permanently out. We want to handle those exceptions gracefully and not let them bubble up to the user. So we want to catch those exceptions as close to the source as possible. However, even if we try to do that and we're as diligent as possible, it's possible that something's going to slip through the cracks, and at some point a user is going to see an exception if we don't take measures to ensure that no matter what happens, we're prepared for it. And that's where a global exception handler comes into play. It's a safety net that will be the catch-all in case all the other fail-safes that we built into the system fail us. And so you build the global exception handler at an application level instead of a page level. So it's a little bit higher up in the hierarchy of ASP.NET's event system. Okay, so at any rate, to kind of illustrate these ideas, it'll be a lot clearer than me just trying to describe them. You can see that I have a new project open, Global Exception Handling, and if you take a look in the code that accompanies this video, I've already closed it down unfortunately, there is a before and after folder. If you want to catch up to where I am right now, just copy the Global Exception Handling project from the before folder into your projects folder, and you will be where I'm at right now. So you can see that I have a default.aspx page with a couple of buttons on them, an error.aspx page that we'll come back to a little bit later in this example, and then we have a global.asax page which will become vitally important. That's where we're going to implement the global exception handler. So to kind of set the stage, you can see that I have a default.aspx page with two buttons. The first button will fire off a call to a static method called SomeMethod that will throw a new exception of type exception. All right, so just something very general. I told you not to do it in the message. Very silly. And then here, the next button will actually fire off or throw a new argument out of range exception. So yes, these are silly examples. I didn't want to go through the exercise of building like a really full-featured example. This will suffice, but just keep in mind that these are things that we could handle, and they're kind of silly to begin with. But we're talking about those things that we don't foresee being a problem. We want to build a catch-all, the global exception handler. Just want to remind you of that. Okay, so we have the OK button click event that will essentially throw a new exception, and then this argument out of range button that will throw a new specific exception of type argument out of range exception. Great. The next thing that we, well, let's go ahead and run the application and see what happens. Hopefully you know what happens based on the previous video. We see that when we hit the exception, switches to Visual Studio, pops up a little window, exception was unhandled by the user code. We could continue on, but we'll see the yellow screen of death. The same would be true if we clicked the other button and went through the same exercise. So how would we handle this from a global perspective? Well, this is where the global.asax page comes in. I think we've talked about this before. This is where you write code to handle events that are fired off at a higher level in the application architecture, at the application level or the session level. Okay, I think when we talked about session state and application state, we talked about this file, global ASAX. Well, we can also implement a global exception handler here by just adding the following method header: void application underscore error, and then we pass in a sender and an event args-e. We're not going to use the input parameters; those will be passed in by the ASP.NET runtime. But at any rate, what we want to do first of all is we'll want to determine exactly what happened. Let me copy and paste some code in. So this event will fire off whenever an exception keeps bubbling and it's about ready to be turned into a yellow page of death and given to the user. So we want to stop right there, and we want to interrupt that event and write our own code. And so the first thing that we're going to do is ask, well, what happened? We're going to call this server object. The server is a HTTP server utility, has a bunch of methods that kind of operate at that higher level. So we're going to get the very last error, and what will be returned back to us is of type HTTP unhandled exception. It'll always be HTTP unhandled exception. That is the exception that triggered the application error. So then how do we find out the original exception that fired off the HTTP unhandled exception? Well, that's why we need to call inner exception. So we're going to use a method of the exception that we just plucked off as the last error on the server, and we're going to call grab a property called inner exception, and that will give us the actual exception that triggered the whole thing off in the first place. And now that we have it, I'll go ahead and just paste in some response.write. This will add the following markup into the response stream. So the page will be delivered to the user, and it'll be a combination of some hard-coded HTML as well as the inner exception object's message, and we'll print that to screen. And then the final thing that we need to do is actually clear the error so that the page can continue through the ASP.NET pipeline and return a result back to the user that's not the yellow page of death. Because if we don't clear the error out here, by the time we hit this spot, we're getting out of the application error. If there's still exceptions to be handled, then we will be delivering the yellow page of death. So this is a crucial line of code. In fact, let me just go ahead and comment that that you must do this if you want to hide the yellow page of death. Any existing exceptions after this point will send the end user the exception page. Okay, so now let's go ahead and run the application. And we'll go ahead and click on the Do Not Click Me button. We still hit the unhandled exception by user code error in the development environment, but if we hit Continue, we'll see that it actually replaces all of the markup in our default.aspx page with this markup that we did a response.write out to the stream. Something bad happened. I told you not to do it. Okay, so very good. Now let's modify our example here, and what I want to do is evaluate the inner exception, and I want to take a look at how we can handle a specific type of exception differently than the rest. So for example, if I know I'm looking for an argument out of range exception, so if that inner exception is a type of argument out of range exception, then I can perform some different logic. In this particular case, I'm going to do a server.transfer to error.aspx. So again, I don't want to talk about this because it's a ASP.NET specific topic, but there's a difference between a response redirect so that we can tell the end user's web browser to go to a different page, and a server transfer, which means I'm going to take the current session and everything and just say deliver this page instead. That's the difference between response redirect, hey, browser redirect yourself, to a server transfer. Hey, I'm going to transfer this request to another page and let it send that page back. In this case, we are transferring to the error.aspx page. Now on the error.aspx page, I just have this don't panic and then a label, and inside the label I'm going to actually do the same thing that I did in the global.aspx page. I'm going to grab the server's last error so that we can evaluate it here on this page. So now that I have, again, the last error, I can grab the inner exception that triggered the exception that bubbled up and grab its message off and just print it in the result label. If we were to just navigate to this page and not have any value in this get last error, at least it'll show something like something went horribly wrong, it wasn't your fault, and display that instead. So if there is no value here, that means you probably just navigated to it by accident or deviously, and so we'll just show a different result label. So let's save all this. Let's go back to the default.aspx page and run the app, and then I'm going to click the argument out of range exception. Alright, so you can see that I hit that here in my development environment, but if I hit the continue button, now we'll see it says default.aspx here in the location bar, but we know that this is the error.aspx page and that we are actually printing out the message of that inner exception, which is an argument out of range. Specified argument was out of the range of the valid values. Okay, so that is how you would create a global exception handler. I want to say one last thing here. We talked about in the future why you would want to log your errors in the previous lesson. And so what I would probably do right about here is I would want to implement my logging logic. If that's log4net, that open source API, I would probably write some code to access it here. If I was doing a homegrown custom logging solution, then I would implement at least the call to that functionality right here as well. Okay, so that is global exception handling. Again, it's your catch-all. It is your safety net in case all of your other try-catch mechanisms that you have in your application fail, or something, squeezes through the cracks and you miss something. At least you capture it here before it hits the end user. Okay, let's continue on with custom exceptions in the very next lesson. We'll see you there. Thanks.